This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 190 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Thomas Maier, an award-winning investigative journalist who has worked at Newsday since 1984. Thomas has written several books over the years, including When Lions Roar, about the Churchills and the Kennedys, and Masters of Sex, which was produced as a series on Showtime for 4 years. This is Thomas's second time here on the podcast. You may remember him from episode number 65, when we discussed his book, Mafia Spies, the inside story of the CIA, gangsters, JFK, and Castro, which has since then been made into a documentary series on the Paramount Plus network. Today he's back to tell us about his newest book, The Invisible Spy, Churchill's Rockefeller Center spy ring, and America's first secret agent of World War II, which is available now. It's the story of Ernest Cuneo, a member of the Roosevelt administration before and during World War II, who became the liaison officer to the British Security Coordination Office located in New York City. The BSC was running intelligence operations inside the United States, and Cuneo was directly involved almost from the start. But before we get into this story, you should know that OC Strategic Academy is here to teach you how to transform your career with the skill of a spy. With OC Strategic Academy, you can learn to understand people on a deeper level, influence decisions, and build connections, and gain the edge you've been missing in work, in life, and in every interaction. Each course has been developed by a former war reporter turned human intelligence collector with extensive experience in the Middle East. The courses include Negotiate Like a Spy and Network Like a Spy, plus several others. There's also private one-on-one coaching available if you're interested in training that is tailored directly to your needs. You can find them at academy.ocstrategic.com and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 10% off any course you decide is right for you. Click the link in the show notes of this episode to level up your human intelligence skills. Thomas, welcome back.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate you inviting me.
Of course. I'm glad that we've stayed in contact over the past couple of years because I am always happy to read a new book on a subject that I know almost nothing about beforehand. And this one really took me by surprise, as I think it will a lot of people.
I hope so. In fact, to some extent, that was the challenge and the allure for me, because my other books have been about great men, great figures in history, as you mentioned, Churchills or the Kennedys. So the idea of doing a book about a guy who was deliberately anonymous, he was the invisible spy, literally and figuratively. It gave me pause about whether or not I wanted to jump into this story initially, because I said, well, how many people would know him? But the more I got into the story, I realized, wow, through the story of Ernest Cuneo, what I could do is tell the story of American espionage, modern American espionage from the very beginning, which was essentially at the beginning of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love to find these little known stories myself, and you clearly devoted a huge amount of time to really digging up so much of this that I didn't know and that practically no one else knew either. But before we talk about Cuneo a little bit, I really want to get back to Mafia Spies just because of the developments that happened since we last talked. So can you tell me a little bit about what it is like to take one of your books and turn it into a very well-regarded television series? Because I see it advertised all the time, and I watched it right when I came out and was just totally blown away that I already knew you, as a matter of fact, when I was watching it on TV.
Well, that's awfully nice of you to say. In fact, I know that Paramount is putting it in for consideration for the Emmys. So we're hoping that maybe we'll win an Emmy. But Mafia Spies, in a nutshell, is about two gangsters hired by the CIA to kill Castro. And so that book came out in 2019. And we were going to do it as a drama, but COVID came along, and that made it impossible. So it was done as a docuseries. And so for me, it was really interesting because I was now before the camera, in front of the camera. It's a documentary, and in many ways, I helped narrate the 6-part series. So that was a really interesting experience for me. I had worked as a TV reporter here in New York for the last 10 years. I worked for Newsday, but I also worked for a television outlet that was its sister station, News 12 here in the New York area. And actually about 3 years ago, I won a New York Emmy for a documentary that I did. But this was big time at Paramount. So it was a lot of fun. And in a way, it's also helped me do this new book, The Invisible Spy.
Oh, okay. That's great to hear. I help you get your momentum going, I'm sure. I'm very curious, how did you first hear about Cuneo? Because just as you mentioned, he was someone that, worked really hard to fly under the radar.
Well, yeah, he did. 10 years ago when I wrote a book called When Lions Roar, The Churchills and the Kennedys, and doing that research, and that's a big fat book. It's about 750 pages. But I came across a reference to the fact that Churchill had put spies at Rockefeller Center. This was in the days before Pearl Harbor, when it was really desperate days for Churchill and the Brits. Hitler was bombing the hell out of London. It was the summer of 1940. In May of 1940, Churchill became the prime minister. And he was a big believer in espionage, Churchill was. And he decided to put a group of spies on the 36th floor of Rockefeller Center. Now, I grew up in New York. I went to school in New York, went to Fordham in the Bronx. I went to Columbia Journalism School. I actually proposed to my wife at Rockefeller Center underneath the Christmas tree one year. And yet I had no idea that there were a group of spies that were up on the 36th floor of the International Building, right across the street from St. Patrick's Cathedral. So that kind of caught my eye. That was 10 years ago in doing that book. And I said, that's really interesting. Maybe there's something there. And actually I did Mafia Spies in the meantime. But I developed, and then as I researched it more, I realized that the American who was dealing with the Churchill spies at Rockefeller Center was this guy named Ernest Cuneo. And who was Cuneo? Well, Cuneo, he went to Columbia like I did. So that kind of caught my attention as well. But he had been a big football star and he went to the NFL. He played as a lineman back in the early days of the NFL. For football fans out there, a guy like Ernest Cuneo, he would play both offense and defense. So he was out there the whole game. You can imagine how dirty his jersey was by the end of the day. But he was a big star there. He went to, when he was on what was the Brooklyn Dodgers NFL football team, he also was going to law school. He gets a law degree. He at first works for Fiorello LaGuardia, who eventually becomes the mayor of New York City, very famous mayor. It's not just, he's not just an airport. He was the mayor. And then Cuneo goes and works for President Roosevelt. He's part of a whole group of really smart people who were lawyers and aides to President Roosevelt, who had come from New York, primarily, some from Harvard, but Cuneo had one or two of them as teachers at Columbia. So he became part of that. Once he gets his law degree, he becomes a Democratic lawyer. He works for the White House. So Cuneo was working with a group of lawyers that some of whom he knew from Columbia. And so when Churchill decided to put the spies in Rockefeller Center, they first went for permission to the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the director of the FBI. And Hoover said, look, I can't give you permission unless it's signed off by the president. And they said, well, how do we do that? And it was Hoover who suggested, I know a guy named Ernest Cuneo. And now Hoover knew Cuneo because Cuneo was also a lawyer for a guy named Walter Winchell, who was like the biggest media star at the time. And Cuneo was his lawyer. But Cuneo was also working for the Democrats and working for the White House. He had a lot of hats, Cuneo. And so the British go to Cuneo, and Cuneo gets the permission of the president. And in return, the president says, I'm saying yes, but Ernest, you'll be the one. Ernie, you should be the one who deals with the British, the Churchill spies at Rockefeller Center. And it had to be top secret, really, really a tight secret, because in 1940, Roosevelt was running for re-election saying, "I won't send your boys and girls, your young people, to fight in a war over in Europe." They had done that in World War I. There were many Americans who were killed. There was a big isolationist mood here in the United States. Most people did not want to see a draft. They didn't want to see us go to war over in Europe. There was a big ocean in between us. And so that's what Roosevelt was saying publicly. But privately, he had already commissioned, by the summer of 1940, about a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, he had directed Cuneo to deal with these spies at Rockefeller Center in the heart of Manhattan, in the biggest foreign spy operation ever to operate within the United States, at least the one that, to the extent that we know about it. And it was Cuneo who was the direct intermediary with them.
There's so much going on there, really, and I'm very shocked. I have several questions, actually, just from what you've said here, but I want to go back really quickly. Cuneo, it just seems like he had this kind of like meteoric rise to the top of I mean, if he's like one of Roosevelt's handpicked guys, did he just have the personality or the capability to go from Columbia Law to working for LaGuardia and then on to the White House? I mean, how did he facilitate those power moves, essentially?
Well, first of all, he was the youngest child in a big Italian-American family. So he was really a bright kid. In a way, he kind of reminded me of the late governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, who was the baby in his family. Ernie Couno was kind of like that, really smart. He was a really good writer, because when he was going to law school, he also had a job at the New York Daily News. At one point, he had been a reporter. And so he knew how to express himself in writing. He was a speech writer for them. He was what is known in politics as an advance man. So he worked for the president by the late 30s. He was working for the president as an advance man. An advance man is somebody who goes and sets up, when somebody's going to give a speech, the president's going to give a speech, he does the advance work. In other words, he sets it all up and arranges things, and sometimes actually writes the speeches. And so he's doing that for Roosevelt. He did that for some of Roosevelt's political allies. So he had his fingers in politics. He had his fingers in the media as the lawyer, particularly for Walter Winchell, who was huge back then. Walter Winchell had literally hundreds of newspaper columns. He had one column that appeared in hundreds of newspapers around the country, but he had a Sunday night radio program. Bear in mind, this is before television. So people would listen on a Sunday night to Walter Winchell the way they would listen to 60 Minutes, only Walter Winchell was even bigger than 60 Minutes, as an example. That's how he was really, really big. And his lawyer was Ernie Cuneo. So Cuneo had politics, he had the media, and now with this appointment to deal with the British spies at Rockefeller Center, he was now beginning his career in the world of espionage.
Okay, I see. So, and you also mentioned, of course, like Hoover kind of paved the way for this to go on, and the British asked permission, which is not normally something you do at the beginning of a spy operation, is ask permission of the host country there. But was, prior to Cuneo joining anyway, were they aware of exactly what the BSC would be doing from Rockefeller Center anyway, or was there some misdirection there as to their true purpose, for example?
You mean misdirection as in lying? Yes. Yes. There was misdirection in the sense that initially the British pitched the permission to the president, and particularly with Hoover, as saying that they were concerned about three things. The one thing that they were very clear about, which was true, was that they were concerned about keeping the supply lines open from America to Great Britain. That, in other words, they were already at war. There were all these German submarines floating around in the Atlantic. So they were concerned that there was nobody here in the United States, that there was no influence by Nazi spies in trying to upset the supply lines to Great Britain, because England very much depended upon some of the grain that we were sending and other supplies, even armaments, selling various different weapons to the Allies and such. So that was number one. That was the number one concern. And that was true enough. But there was two other things that they wanted to do. One is they wanted to keep an eye on the Nazi spies already in the United States, and also keep an eye on the isolationists and people who were Nazi sympathizers who were American citizens. There was a very big group called the American German Bund that was fairly sizable. In fact, they had a big rally at Madison Square Garden where they were essentially giving Nazi salutes. And so the British were very concerned about that. But fundamentally, thirdly, the thing that they kind of lied about was that they wanted to run a big propaganda operation here in the United States, trying to convince America to get into the war, because without America's participation, it was pretty much acknowledged that England, that Great Britain would lose the war, and that Hitler would invade Great Britain, and he would have all of Europe, certainly all of Western Europe. And so these were the three factors that the British had, maybe one and a half of which they were upfront about. But Cuneo became very sympathetic pretty quickly to their cause across the board. But he didn't realize just that the Brits would not only have a covert operation, but they had not only of intelligence, but they had covert operations where they were literally going after people who were either Nazi spies. And in fact, the beginning of my book begins with an incident where two Nazi spies are walking in Times Square in New York City, and one of them gets hit by a car. They're carrying briefcases with them, a satchel. And in those satchels, some of the papers, they're planning to blow up New York, particularly if America gets into the war. And one of the two German spies gets hit by a car. The other one picks up the satchel and runs away. And they were posing as somehow as a Spanish officials, but they were actually German. They heard that they were speaking German, and they eventually, with the help of the British, the New York City police, who were the first on the scenes, and then the FBI, who were called in, they were clueless about who this dead man was. They checked with the Spanish embassy, and it didn't check out. It wasn't Spanish. And it was pretty clear that he was a German spy, but they had no idea exactly who he was. But the British did. The British were already here. They were already tracking things, and they were able to, they were checking people's mail. When mail would go from America to overseas, it would often go through Bermuda. And they had a separate spy operation where they were checking people's mail, and they were actually came across the letter from the surviving German agent who was writing back home. And he talked about the accident, and that's how they were able to find out who he was. And so when the FBI said, geez, we don't know who this dead guy is, they found that out essentially through the British spies at Rockefeller Center. And that's how it all begins. That's how my book begins, with that fatal accident at Times Square.
That really is an astonishing story. And I think we may have mentioned that on a previous episode. Thomas, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Are you familiar with the movie The House on 92nd Street?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I've kind of indulged myself in some of these older movies that were part of that era. Alfred Hitchcock was one of the people who was providing information to the British spies at Rockefeller Center, as was Noel Coward, as was Cary Grant. A number of people were providing information. In fact, even Churchill's literary agent was an informant and came over here and was providing information. So yeah, it was it's an interesting time period. And what's really appealing to me as a writer is what was going on then is very much kind of what's going on today. Ernest Cuneo was, in his own way, a deep state figure. We hear this phrase, a deep state figure, and it sounds like it's baloney, or I could use more of a barnyard term for that. But you know what I'm saying? That it sounds like it's baloney, but that's exactly what Ernest Cuneo was. We hear about disinformation and propaganda. that's kind of like what's going on today as it was back then.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea of a country being invaded and by a despot, by an autocrat, or trying to protect democracy from tyranny that was going on back then is kind of very reflected in what's going on today. So, I thought that was part of the appeal in doing this whole book.
Yeah, it is really amazing, the cyclical nature of history. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I really loved about your book was how it for me, it really blurred the lines with Ernest and with the BSC. As a matter of fact, like I was questioning, is Ernest a liaison for the United States, or is he an asset of the British at some points? Because he was trying to sell their operations to the Roosevelt administration,
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And, maybe at this point I should also say there were two really good friends of Ernest Cuneo's that he develops among these British spies who worked at Rockefeller Center. One of the spies that he meets is a guy named Ian Fleming. Now, Ian Fleming was working for the British Naval Intelligence, really creative guy, really smart, very sophisticated. And Ernest and Ian Fleming become really good friends. It's kind of a odd couple type of a friendship, but they do become good friends. They meet initially at Rockefeller Center. They remain friends throughout the war. Later on, they go into business together. They run a newspaper syndication and they work together. But Ian Fleming, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, was the author of all of the James Bond novels. And he created James Bond. And so later, after the war, Ernest is providing legal advice, but also creative advice to his friend Ian Fleming as Fleming is putting together the James Bond books. In fact, at one point, they go on a road trip across America together, and it's all part of the research for Fleming in putting together the Bond books, in particular, Diamonds Are Forever, but particularly Thunderball, which is a novel by Fleming that's dedicated to Ernest Cuneo, that at one point, Cuneo actually wrote the initial draft of Thunderball, the movie, and also Fleming wanted Cuneo. He said that Ernie had a sinister face. And originally, Thunderball, the bad guy, was not going to be Spectre, but was going to be a mafia figure. And he wanted Ernie Cuneo to be the bad guy in the movie. And Ernest Cuneo, who had grown up as an Italian American and had faced a fair amount of prejudice back in those days, as many Italian Americans did, immigrants to this country, wasn't thrilled about that. Fleming thought it was funny. Ernest kind of like he wasn't laughing about it, but they were such good friends that they all took it in good stride. But that was stuff that I don't think anybody knew, and that was really fascinating. One last point about that I thought was really interesting is that after the war, both Fleming, Cuneo, a person that oversaw the British spies at Rockefeller Center, a guy named William, quote unquote, Intrepid Stevenson, who was the head spy there, they all had a desire to let people know after a number of years after World War II of what had happened. They were all very proud of what they had done. And they should have been. It was remarkable, some of the things that they did. And so for Fleming, he found the way to express that desire for recognition through the creative fictional device of the James Bond novels, particularly Casino Royale. There's a couple of scenes that come right out of Fleming's own experience. But Stevenson, there was a book that was written about him that became an ABC television miniseries and such. And towards the end of his life, Cuneo wrote a memoir that wound up not being published. His papers were given to the FDR library, but it's that unpublished memoir that was given to me by Cuneo's family and the papers up at the FDR library that really are the heart of my book, The Invisible Spy.
Oh, wow. My gosh, that must have been an enormous help. An unpublished manuscript, that's got to be very rare as the basis for a modern espionage history. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it definitely helped a lot. And it even provided some explanation of the friendship between Ian Fleming, and Cuneo himself. He was a pretty, as I mentioned, he was a writer. He had worked for the New York Daily News, and so he's a pretty astute observer, more about politics than about human emotions, but he does have some things about human emotions. Particularly, it's interesting his analysis, if you will, of Ian Fleming, who was an interesting character. He was a pretty, I don't know if Randy, I guess Randy is the right word for Ian Fleming. He had a pretty complicated sex life, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a cad, or that's kind of an old term, I guess, but it's a complicated love life that Fleming had. Whereas Ernie Cuneo meets another person at Rockefeller Center, a woman named Margaret Watson. She's part of the group of female spies at Rockefeller Center. And he starts romancing her. And they eventually, at the end of the war, get married. But, to your point earlier, what was interesting to me when you say, was Ernie an asset for the British, or was he clearly just an American official working for the Americans, or had he become a British asset? Well, it's interesting because when you fall in love with a British spy, and in talking to Cuneo's daughter about the relationship of her parents when they first met, the daughter Sandra Cuneo said to me that her mother would never have dated Ernest Cuneo if Bill Stevenson had said no. But Stevenson was dealing on a regular basis with Cuneo on all these different espionage operations. So it's not, if you want to secure the cooperation of somebody like Cuneo, it doesn't hurt to have one of your female spies romancing Cuneo. And I think it was sincere, but I don't think as manipulative as it could have been. But it certainly didn't hurt the British to have one of their own going out with the point person, the American that was going to make everything happen for them.
Yeah, that certainly worked out very well for Ernest's future children and for the BSC as well. It sounds like, no question about it. So do you get any sense of, I guess I would say, was there any divided loyalty there, or was it like a loyalty to his friends at the BSC as opposed to the UK government, for example?
Well, it's interesting. His son, Cuneo's son, Jonathan Cuneo, was a very distinguished attorney. He died about 2 years ago of cancer. I actually dedicate The Invisible Spy to him. He's one of the people that I dedicate the book to. And he was very helpful. But he said to me very early on, he said, if it had become public what my father was doing on behalf of the president, he said, Roosevelt very well could have been impeached for what he was doing, because Cuneo had been very much operating, very sympathetic to the British point of view. And while certainly Roosevelt was sanctioning this and fundamentally realized that America would have to get in the war, the rest of the country really did not want to get involved in the war. And it was a slow process, which was finally, the dam broke when Pearl Harbor happened. Ironically, it was the Japanese bombing at Pearl Harbor that got us into the war. But for the better part of at least 2 or 3 years, the British were desperate that we would get involved in the war and come to their aid and come to their rescue in many ways. And we were taking our sweet time about it. And so, it's very interesting. Again, it's kind of interesting to see how that kind of reflects what's going on today in trying to help the democracy in the Ukraine survive.
Mm-hmm. We certainly know now, in hindsight, of course, that we were on the winning side in World War II, and we became a superpower pretty much as a result of that. But at the same time, it did cost the lives of over, I think, 350,000 U.S. troops, and probably far more than that wounded and that sort of thing. So I can understand why there was a lack of a desire for people to get into a land war in Europe again, and it worked out. I guess it worked out well for us, as it could have, certainly. But it's absolutely true that once we were involved, it was a whole of society, a whole of government effort, and many many people went over there and did not come back as well. So I have some empathy, for the concerns of some of the isolationists at that time. But at the same time, the Brits, they have been for many many decades, one of our strongest allies, and they still are to this day. I question how much of that is from like the efforts of the BSC and that sort of thing, and how much of it is because of our similar cultures and our shared heritage and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, and I think the some of the isolationists, Joe Kennedy makes an appearance in The Invisible Spy. He was the U.S. ambassador in London. He was a notorious isolationist, but having done a book about the Kennedys 20 years ago and have access to the Joe Kennedy papers at the JFK Library, I can tell you a lot of the impetus for him was that he had 3 sons and he didn't want to see them being killed or winding up maimed. And at the end of the war, his oldest son was killed in the war. JFK, his second oldest son, was severely injured in the Navy in the Pacific during the war. And so, of course, a lot of people just didn't want to see their children lost and that's a very understandable, very natural thing. But there's evil in this world, and democracy is generally the best form of government that has been devised thus far. And it's worth fighting for at times, not every day, but when it's necessary. And Roosevelt came to that decision. He realized that it unfortunately would be necessary. Bear in mind, Roosevelt himself had sons who served in the war. I think it was Elliott Roosevelt who was in the plane behind Joe Kennedy Jr. when Joe Kennedy Jr.'s plane blew up. Yeah, so it's not that Roosevelt's kids were out of harm's way. Ditto with Randolph Churchill, who was the only son of Winston Churchill, and he was in some of the more aggressive things. He was in a commando group in Northern Africa, as an example. And so, they all had skin in the game, if you will. They all had children who were very much at risk. They weren't taking deferments. They weren't claiming that they got their heels injured on a clay tennis court at Fordham. I went to Fordham, so every time I see that clay court, I think of somebody. But, they didn't. And look, I'm of a generation where the Vietnam War was over by the time I came of age. And so the idea of going off to war was not a big part of my generation, but it was of this generation I'm talking about in The Invisible Spy. And they all had to come to grips with that and what it would mean in their lives. And so there's an inherent drama that has always, as a writer, has always appealed to me with these type of stories.
Yeah, no question about it. So, Thomas, you did mention earlier something about covert operations in the U.S., and I recall from the book there was the mention of it was called a disposal squad, right? So was that just a rumor, or was there more to it than that, truly, like operations inside the U.S.?
In his memoir, Cuneo actually mentions that a British agent was killed right along the East River on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I tried my damnedest to see what I could substantiate that with any records or anything. That's the type of thing was not going to be reported to the police. And so it kind of just lays out there. I mention it in there, but they did have a disposal squad who went after British people who had defected, who had come over here. And they were also going after, there was somebody on a Portuguese ship. The Portuguese were neutral in the war, as I recollect, at least at that point. And there was somebody who was essentially murdered or taken care of, if you will. There's the first spy that was hung by the British was actually somebody who was a spy here in the United States. And they waited until he came back to England for some reason. And they basically gathered the information on this guy when he was in the United States. But it wasn't until he went back to England for 1940, it might have been 41, but he went back, and that's when they prosecuted him, and they wound up hanging him as their first, traitor
Hmm.
of World War II. That was for the British. The other thing is that was interesting is that Margaret Watson, the woman who becomes Ernest Cuneo's wife and was working throughout the war as a British spy at Rockefeller Center, one night she was attacked by somebody who was a German speaking. This was a story that was told to me by both the son of Cuneo and by the daughter. Both of them are attorneys. They both have a very healthy respect for the truth. And they both told me the story of what had happened to their mother, where somebody was in her room. There was like a dormitory for the female spies of Churchill's working at Rockefeller Center, and Margaret Watson was living in this dormitory, and she apparently was working in some of the stuff regarding finances and to some extent having to do with South American espionage. And for whatever reason, there was somebody who attacked her, put a pillow over her head and tried to smother her. And she wiggled out of it, called for help. They came and Stevenson shows up, and things were taken care of with that person. What exactly happened to that attacker? Nobody, certainly none of the Cuneo children knew what happened there, but they presumed that he was taken care of. So there was that element of violence inherent in all of this espionage.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. A lot of it sounds like you're right. It would be very hard to verify because it was very intentionally hushed up when it was happening, I'm sure, but some really tantalizing stuff there, no question.
Yeah, when you're a historian, I mean, you have to be very careful not to trade in rumors or things that aren't unverifiable. And yet there are things where you have some things in writing or claims that you have to judge the veracity of the source, that you have to say, okay, everything else checks out here. And would that be true? So like with that story, I definitely got the sense that it had happened.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So, of course, as we know, the U.S. was drawn into the war in December 1941. How did that change things for the BSC and for Cuneo himself? Because a lot of their efforts had, I don't know if I'd say come to fruition, but were not necessary at the very least anymore. So did they pivot to other operations once the U.S. was fully engaged?
They did. One of the things that they were doing, what the British were doing, they ran a camp. It was called Camp X. It was right on the Canadian border, just north of Niagara Falls, and it was in Canada. It was right near Niagara Falls, as I mentioned. But that's where they were training undercover agents how to kill people. Like one of the things about putting like rocks in a sock and swinging the sock around and hitting a person in the head, how to slice the throat of somebody, come up from behind and slice the throat, how to fight in a hand-to-hand battle, also explosives, all other types of sabotage. And these were things that were taught by the Brits to their own spies at Camp X. But then the Americans, once the war starts in particular, we created an agency called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and that was headed by a decorated former war hero from World War I, a guy named William Wild Bill Donovan. And Wild Bill Donovan was the head of the OSS, and they decided to bring some of the Americans up to Camp X so that they would learn how to become highly skilled undercover commandos, saboteurs, and creating havoc for the Nazis, particularly over in Europe. And that later, those folks are sent over to Europe during the war. So that was all part of what happened there. The big thing was the creation of, as I mentioned, the OSS, which was our first spy agency. Previous to this, it was the view of the Americans, particularly notably the Secretary of State at the time, Henry Stimson, who famously said, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." And that was kind of the reference about we don't do that type of spying. And so even though Winston Churchill was a big advocate of spying, had been involved in it since he was a young man, he was a spy during the Boer War, as an example, even though the Russians had a very sophisticated espionage system. Certainly the Abwehr of the German, that was the German spy agency. They had a very elaborate spy agency, but we had none. And it was something that President Roosevelt was reluctant to do, but then he appointed Donovan as the head of the OSS when Pearl Harbor happens. And he basically tells them, thank heavens that we have something going on already with the Cuneo and with the British spies at Rockefeller Center. So very quickly, the OSS grows. It actually exceeds the size of the British spy operations. And that's a whole part of this story as well. Ernest Cuneo his title becomes codified. It becomes he's formally made into the quote liaison of the OSS, dealing not only with the British spies, but also with the Justice Department, with the FBI, with the State Department. The guy who is essentially the national security advisor in the State Department was a former Columbia teacher of Ernest Cuneo, who you had known for many years. So Cuneo had his fingers in a lot of different agencies. He just was one of those people who was a real deep state figure, a behind the scenes fixer, a person who could make things happen. It's one thing to give a public speech, but you've got to make it happen if you want to have an effective government. And you need lawyers, usually lawyers. Roosevelt had a lot of lawyers who were smart people, who knew how to make government work. And Cuneo was certainly one of them.
So did he stay in that specific position for the duration of the war all the way through, summer 1945 or beyond?
He did. He made a lot of money working with Walter Winchell. He was the lawyer for Walter Winchell, who was a very popular media figure, had a big Sunday night radio program. There was no television at the time. And so Cuneo made a lot of money. He also represented another big media figure who had a column in numerous newspapers and also had his own radio show. And that was a guy named Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson's column was called the Washington Merry-Go-Round. People of our era might remember Jack Anderson, who was a very prominent investigative reporter. Well, he took over from Drew Pearson, and he actually worked as a young man for Pearson. So Cuneo was the lawyer for both Drew Pearson, but particularly for Walter Winchell. And so Cuneo made a lot of money. There was at one point late in the war where some people who were upset about the OSS and they were upset about people within the United States government were making a stink about that Cuneo had maybe too much power or something to that effect. And so Cuneo waived a salary. He didn't take any salary towards the end of the war, just so that he could be his own man. And what was remarkable about Cuneo was that he had a very diverse portfolio of interests. Like, as I mentioned, he reported to the White House, to the State Department. He was the liaison for all these different characters, but he kind of set his own agenda. And William Donovan, who was theoretically his boss, he was out there. Donovan was out there. It was over in Europe. He was traveling all around the place. So actually, in a way, Cuneo dealt more with Bill Stevenson, the Brit, here over in the United States than he did with Donovan, it seemed. Donovan was not a great administrator either. So that kind of caused some problems towards the end of the war that I talk about in my book. But so Cuneo was his own man, which is hard to do during the war. I mean, he reported to everybody, he dealt with everybody, but he did it in a way on his own terms.
That's got to be such a tremendous balancing act caught between all those different administrative organizations. And I'm sure there were power plays left and right going on, even although, we were supposedly like a united front for the duration of the war, of course. But that really speaks to his capacity for dealing with people. If he could stay in that position and maintain a level of kind of personal independence and personal power throughout. So that's very impressive, honestly, that he stayed and did what he wanted to for the duration.
It is. And, one of the ways that he did that, and this was, I thought, really interesting to me. I played football in high school, but I didn't not beyond that. And Cuneo was a star football player at Columbia. And the New York Times wrote about him in its sports sections. There was a time in his life where he was really seeking fame. He got hurt and he eventually realized, particularly in the NFL, by the second season, he realized he was going to lose an eye. He had been injured on his face. This is,
Oh, wow.
if you go back and you look at the photographs, they didn't have face guards back then. They just had these kind of rudimentary helmets that they were running around. It was more like rugby than it was football by today's standards, with all these protective devices on NFL players. He played in the NFL, and he realized as a lineman that he was going to maybe lose his eye. And that was part of the rationale of why he got out of there. But what he did learn from playing football was that rather than seeking fame, that he could be more effective as a teammate, that he should be to be a good teammate often required not taking credit directly for things, not going around saying it was all because of me that this thing happened, but helping behind the scenes make it happen, and that you would be even more valuable. So he learned that even more so working for the president, and that was drilled into his head by some of the FDR top aides who basically wanted him to remain anonymous, and that behind the scenes, by being anonymous, by being invisible, he could that was the source of his power, that he could do things, he could be much more effective. If people, when they listened to the radio program of Walter Winchell, and he's reporting it as news, the public was unaware of how Cuneo had got a lot of those things as tips from the British or from the White House, and how that was fed to Walter Winchell. And at times Cuneo wrote it himself and Winchell read it on the air. So these are, when you are willing to be anonymous, when you're willing to be behind the scenes, that was the key to his power. You could be more effective. And that's why he had such an extraordinary career. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was the role of Allen Dulles, because in my previous book, Mafia Spies, he's kind of the bad guy. He's the one who authorizes the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that becomes a big secret and such. But in The Invisible Spy, it's interesting to see about Allen Dulles, because early on in World War II, Allen Dulles was quite a good spy. He dealt with Ernest Cuneo at Rockefeller Center. The Americans actually opened an office for a time at Rockefeller Center as well, working with the British. And Allen Dulles worked with Ernest Cuneo. Cuneo had the idea of that you could get the floor plans for buildings all around the world through insurance agencies, and this would inform where to place bombs and things of that nature. And he told that to Allen Dulles, and that was one of their early successes together. Dulles goes off to Switzerland. He becomes a very successful spy. But after World War II, Allen Dulles becomes the head of the CIA, and he's still in contact with Ernest Cuneo. I quote a letter that Cuneo sends to Dulles, and it's about somebody who thinks maybe a double agent, a spy and whatever. And he writes a note, it's kind of a heads up note to Dulles. But they remain friendly. And so when Dulles becomes a member of the Warren Commission, when JFK is killed in 1963, Dulles is put on the Warren Commission investigating that. And one of the things that I found that I was really amazed by is that I found FBI documents, two of them, one of them written by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. Would have been in early 1964, in which apparently Allen Dulles was leaking to Ernest Cuneo about what was going on in the Warren Commission while they were still investigating. This is before the report came out. While they were still investigating JFK's murder. And Cuneo is ostensibly going to do a big thing for the Saturday Evening Post through that agency, NANA, that he's working through. He's kind of like an independent person there. But it's the friendship that Dulles is leaking directly to Cuneo. And how do I know this? Well, Cuneo goes to the FBI. He goes to Hoover, and he sees a couple of people at the FBI, and basically they say, whoa, we've been told by the president not to say anything about what's going on. This is the death of the president. But Cuneo makes it pretty clear that his source, he makes it very clear that Alan Dulles is talking to him, and he just wants Hoover to confirm some of the stuff. It's kind of like inside the Warren Commission. And so when I found those records, I was amazed by that. So it really interesting to me, the role of Alan Dulles in my experiences, particularly with this book. I was really surprised because it's really the only known leak of the Warren Commission to a source outside the government during that whole time period. And once again, it kind of draws some even more skepticism that already exists about what Alan Dulles did when he was on the Warren Commission. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
Absolutely. It really is amazing, the level of connection that Mayo had, no question about it. What an astonishing figure. And that one that, is the furthest thing from a household name, too. And yet here he is popping up all over the decades, really, all these incredibly critical junctures of American history.
Just one last point on that. There was a very famous novelist by the name of Gore Vidal, fabulous writer, novelist. And he wrote a novel towards the end of his life where Ernest Cuneo showed up as a character in there. And he describes, one of the characters describes Ernie Cuneo, Ernest Cuneo, and says he was at the center of everything, that he knew everything, that he was specifically the quote was about that Cuneo was at the center of everything. And in fact, one of the chapters in my book, I use that phrase, the center of everything. And that's exactly explained the life and career of Ernest Cuneo.
Very cool. What a fascinating guy. So after the war ended, did he leave the government work behind, or did he still have a role to play?
Well, after the war, Cuneo wrote in one of the papers that I examined that he said that both he and Ian Fleming, his pal, who would go on to write the James Bond books, that they both had this, they felt like divers who in the sea who would come up suddenly and get the bends, that in other words, there was such a decompression from the heightened sense of the war and the thrillingness. And yes, it was filled with tragedy, but it was also the most extraordinary times of their life. So when it was over, they felt almost like this decompression. And he expresses it. And I mentioned that in my book. And what they eventually wind up doing is that Ernie Cuneo becomes very good friends after the war. He remains very good friends with Ian Fleming. And they buy, with the help of another friend of Fleming's, they buy a news syndicate in which Cuneo runs it in New York. Ian Fleming runs the London office, and it's an agency where they're able to keep some of their espionage sources and such. It's a paycheck for them, and it becomes another way in which the two friends who were together during the war as spies are now together in this business. It was called NANA. It was the North American Newspaper Alliance was the name of the company. And it was a way of staying in touch. They would summer together upstate. Fleming, when he was over here in New York, his friend Ivor Bryce, who is the friend that I referred to, was also part of this company. He was married to a very wealthy woman. He had a house in the Saratoga area by the racetrack in upstate New York. Cuneo had a summer house as well up there. And so they were summer, and that's where they would talk about the James Bond ideas, and they would spitball ideas about James Bond, particularly the first novel, Casino Royale. It kind of replicates some of their experiences and some of the people that they dealt with in real life as a spy.
Amazing stuff. And in some way, his legacy still lives on with every new novel that comes out and every new movie that comes out as well. So Ernest has still got a little part to play, and that sounds like that's incredible.
Yeah, definitely so.
Wow. Well, this is a fascinating book, Thomas. I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with me, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to read it as well. For the listeners, there is a lot more to this story that we haven't had time to go over during this interview, of course. So I really encourage you to pick it up on your own. The book is titled The Invisible Spy, Churchill's Rockefeller Center Spy Ring, and America's First Secret Agent of World War II by Thomas Maier. It's available now as soon as you've heard this episode, and can't recommend it strongly enough. So, Thomas, thank you so much. Do you have another book that you're working on now that this has been published, or are you taking some time for yourself, or what?
I am working on another book, and hopefully it's done in the next year or two, but I'm very much deep into it.
So, Thomas, is there a website or social media page or anything like that that you can share with the listeners if they want to follow along with you after they've listened to this episode?
Yes, of course. Invisible Spy is available on any Amazon and other online bookstores, and hopefully your local bookstore as well. You can go to my website, which is thomasmaierbooks.com, and I've got plenty of stuff on there. On YouTube, I've got a couple of videos that are related to the Invisible Spy. Some of the stories that I've mentioned here, I also have a video version on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel there as well that you can go to. And so hopefully I've covered all the bases.
Okay, yeah, very cool. We will link those up in the show notes. I think I'm already subscribed to your channel. I'll have to double check, but I think I subscribed a little while back. So I'll go find it again, and I'll put the link in the show notes for everybody else as well.
Great. Yeah, I have like about 3 or 4 different links, different aspects of the story. And in fact, I just put 2 up over the weekend. Though, in fact, the one about JFK and the one about Rockefeller Center, I just put up there.
Great. Okay, yeah, I'll pull those up right after this then. Well, thank you so much, Thomas. This is fascinating, and I really appreciate you sharing the story with us, and I look forward to what you're working on after this.
Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.